our presentations with Father David Fernandez Davalos. He's director of the Iberoamericana in Mexico City and Tijuana, and former rector of Iberoamericana in Puebla, and of the Jesuit University in Guadalajara. He also was director of the Miguel Peró Human Rights Center and is a graduate in philosophy and social science and theology. He has a postgraduate degree in sociology. He's the founder and the director of the Street Children and Worker Children Support Movement in Veracruz, Mexico. And he earned 2 distinguished awards, Human Rights Watch in 1996, and the National Award on Equality and No Discrimination in this past year. Congratulations, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting, the invitation. Secondly, I would like to share with you what we are trying to think, to build, and to do in Latin America towards the change, the shape of the world, and changing the model. As a conclusion to this extraordinary colloquium, I think it is clear that we are in a world in crisis, and we are looking for new ways, and we need at least the following elements. First, a new hermeneutic or point of view. It is to build the story, the history from the point of its reverse, of the victims of the story, the poor and the excluded. Secondly, we need ethics. Above any other social understanding, we need compassion as the main imperative and beginning of any human relation. And thirdly, we need an utopia, or at least a theoretical idea of where we want to go as a project of a world transformed in favor of those who suffer. Today, we pursue some clear guidelines: sustainability, justice, equality. These names begin greater than their parts, being greater than their parts. The greatest peril in the world today is not the terrible inequality, nor the terrible poverty suffered by human beings, not even the extreme corruption of the political and ruling class, or its submission to the dictates of a blind and ruthless market. I think the worst part is running out of mobilizing dreams. We have no utopias that produce the effect we want, and no projects to generate transforming activities. Today, for example, voting for a left or right-wing party seems to be the same. Whoever wins will have no choice but to enforce the global technocratic policies at the service of the great transnational capital and its regulation organisms. Thus, the only possible future horizon is an absolute free market. The only horizon proposed by technoliberal utopia is its consumer receipt and the idea that societies that nurture greed and lack of solidarity among its members generate greater benefits than those that give preference to individual desires over collective needs. We have to think another time, what are we going to, what for, And we need another thinking. Another thinking, not impartial. We must be objective, but not impartial. Therefore, another characteristic of the project we need take sides for the lowest classes. It demands the construction of social coexistence, urgent and attention to the needs and demands of those who have less, of those most vulnerable, of those who are nothing or nobody. Food, health, education, housing, as Pope Francis says, techo, trabajo, y tierra, roof, work, and land. These are logical and necessary priors in front of the claims made in more developed worlds where supposedly man's basic rights have been secured. So far, history has been recorded in terms of progress and development, within which human beings evolve from low to high levels in ascending order towards a better future for humanity. Well regarded, this is a mythical conception, that is to say ideological, that history itself has destroyed. However, we still view the passing of time in this way. Our children should live better than we do in the same logic of linear progress, with more wealth, better jobs, and more resources. This is, in fact, Aristotle's paradigm. Potency becomes act, but this is not the way the world works. So, what should we do to improve? I will now describe the central paradigms of what we can define not as an alternative program, but as something more profound, an alternative way to do politics. Slavoj Žižek, or Žižek, or always controversial and intriguing, proposes doing nothing. Indeed, this Slovak philosopher defends Bartleby's strategy, the Melville's character, an extremely passive clerk who answered all his boss's requests saying, "I'd rather not do it." To exemplify his strategy, Žižek explains the plot of José Saramago's novel Essay on Lucidity. This is the story of the strange events that happened in the nameless capital of an unidentified democratic country when the majority of the population casts blank ballots. The government and the political parties panic. Is it a conspiracy organized to overthrow the government in power and the democratic system? In this case, who is behind and how could they organize the subversion of hundreds of thousands of people without being discovered? The government stigmatized the movement as pure terrorism and not adulterated, declares a state of emergency and cancels all constitutional guarantees. Then the government kidnaps, arrests, tortures, disappears hundreds of citizens, creates chaos in the city, and the government itself assaults the local governments. However, these actions don't work. The population resists the government's attacks with an astonishing unity and a Gandhian non-violent resistance level. For Žižek, voters' abstentions goes beyond the intrapolitical negation, the not trust vote that rejects the same framework of decision. Opposite to this active abstention suggested by Badiou and Zizek, Boaventura de Souza proposes 3 types of actions to resist domination. These actions that can be performed at any time and in any place are democratize, decolonize, and decommercialize reality. This is a brief description. Democratize means democratize democracy. Reject the idea that liberal representative democracy is the only valid form of democracy and legalize other forms of democratic deliberation. For example, de Souza speaks of participative democracy or community democracy. In a private conversation, a colleague, Ilan Semo, declares that he could not grant the notion of democracy to liberal democracy anymore. It is rather a system of oligarchic variation in different places. In fact, we have a parliamentary oligarchy, just like the existing parliamentary monarchies. The distinction between revolution and democracy must be ended. This is one of the conceptual frauds of the left wing, who uses the concept of democracy to take right-wing positions. Decolonize means trying to eliminate oppression based on the supposedly natural, racial, or ethnic cultural inferiority of the oppressed. Among many other colonial relations, we find racism present in history books, news programs, policy repression, semantic preconceptions, devaluation or repression of cultural diversity, public transportation, and daily interpersonal relations. It can also be found in international relations, mostly in relations between colonizing powers and new independent countries. Here, colonialism combines with imperialism. The Portuguese sociologist de Souza maintains that refusing to assess the historical colonialism and disclose what happened and how it happened is another example of a particularly lacerating present-day colonialism. In the epistemological field, colonialism is revealed by giving it the monopoly of knowledge valid to modern science and Western philosophy. Thus, the devaluation of other popular, traditional, urban, and rural knowledge that regulates the daily life of a large majority of the world's population comes about. By underestimating this knowledge, the social groups that possess this knowledge are so devalued. Internal colonialism appears in various forms, as the sociologist. For example, the privatization of small holdings that were social property originally. Also, the authoritarianism of public administration, exercise over citizens, the repression of cultural diversity, and the lack of recognition for the authorities that existed before colonization. Another internal colonialism is found in the lack of recognition for the languages and cultures of the ethnical minorities and the denial to recognize the right to autonomy and self-government. Finally, decommercialize means to question some commonplaces or collective evidence about the economic operation of society. Some of the evidences mentioned by de Souza are to conceive development as an endless development based on an intense appropriation of nature, This conception leads to disaster, as has been recognized even by Pope Francis. Or to reduce welfare to material well-being. This cliché ignores the multi-dimensions of life essential for full human development. Decommercialize also means to understand the many logics of economic relationships that did not go through the accumulation of wealth or the earning of profits and price. Some of these logics existed before capitalism and still survive. Some others emerged with capitalism to oppose it. The natives' concept of good life is the expression of a non-capitalistic system that still survives. So, decommercialize means to prevent market economy from extending its scope of action to such an extent that it transforms society into a market society where everything can be bought or sold, even ethical values and political options. The imperative need to decommercialize personal, social, political, and cultural lives means to promote forms of fair social economy, to subject the use and management of essential and strategic resources and services to democratic public control, to decommercialize nature as far as possible, for example, water, to define a new generation of fundamental rights, nature's rights, humans' right to water, land, biodiversity, and the ensuing consecration of new common goods, to prohibit financial land and food speculation, to transform food sovereignty at the heart of agrarian policies so that countries cease to be dependent on food imports as far as possible, to regulate agrofuels strictly because of the impact they have on security and food sovereignty, to include the decrease of working time in the job promotion policies, etc., etc. From my own point of view, and looking at the horizon from a different perspective, the transforming strategy of the reality we need must find its way between the impulse of minor reforms that end up leading to a total collapse. Here we must remember Mao, for example, who distrusted even a minimal concession to market economy, a well-founded position as we have witnessed it, and the radical reforms that then strengthen the system in the long run, for example, Roosevelt's New Deal, among others. This brings up the permanent necessity to distinguish important reforms regardless of scope and size. It also brings up questions about the radicalness of different forms of resistance. Quite often, a minimal legal reform aimed at bringing the system into line with the ideological objectives it professes may be more subversive than the evident questioning of the basic assumption of the system. In addition, the Truth Transforming Act is an intervention that acts not only within a given background, but rather alters its coordinates and therefore makes it visible as a background. Thus, in contemporary politics, an act must alter the category of background of the economy, making its political dimension tangible. Remember Wendy's Brown's caustic question: if Marxism had anything of value for political theory, was it not the insistence that the problem of freedom was contained in the social relations implicitly declared apolitical, that is to say, naturalized in the liberal discourse, with our organization of a native villages, workers, women, and migrants, the idea is to make it understood that the rules of the economic game in which we develop are inclined in favor of transnational corporations and financial capital. This must be made visible. There is no economic neutrality or free market because economic is dominated by the powerful. It is highly political. But we must also change culture. Every revolution comprises two different aspects: the factual revolution and the spiritual reform. That is to say, the real struggle for state power and the virtual struggle for the transformation of customs, the essence of daily life. In the latter case, people's organizations play a fundamental role while the conditions for achieving the first are being generated. Postmodern left wings blames traditional Marxists, Leninists for focusing on seizing state power. However, the successes obtained in seizing that power failed in the achievement of its objectives. As a result, they maintain that the left-wing movements should adopt a different strategy, apparently more modest, but in fact much more radical. Withdraw from the power of the state and focus on the direct transformation of the social life network and everyday uses that underpin the social structure. That is why homosexual rights, human rights, and other movements are important. The problem is that these movements rely on state organizations, just like social economy and solidarity organizations, which not only serve their needs, but also provide the framework for their activity, state civilian life. That is the reason why there can be no government without social movements, as Tom Negri said, but there can be no social movements without government either. That is, without a state power that supports their space and allows them to develop. That is why we cannot ignore the struggle for electoral or revolutionary state power. For this to be possible, the creation, development, and strengthening of social movements and revolutionary patience is required. Nothing that has been said is possible if we do not have a conscious policy to avoid the control of the state. As we have seen, we cannot have a revolutionary policy either outside or within the framework of the state. Again, Badiou maintains that we should do it at some distance from the state, outside, not destroying, but rather questioning the state, not destroying the state, but rather improving it or moderating its evil character. The form adopted by state power is not secondary, but crucial. It's not only a question of resisting the state government, but also of appropriating it. In any case, we must look for the germ of historical change in the social dynamics that break with the inertia of the established. A few examples of the thousands of small cracks that run through the wall of that is given and fatal are cooperatives and groups of ecological consumption, collective investment alternatives, crowdfunding, Ocupa, squatting platforms, victims of mortgage, slow movements, decline, rural and urban popular resistance organizations, politically aware and mobilized indigenous communities, free distribution of software and cultural works through copyleft licenses, reception and defense of migrant groups, ethical banking, movements claiming racial or sexual differences, human rights groups that understand them as rights of the poor, Trans-Pacific Partnership Treaty, analysis, barter alternatives, medical alternatives, fight for territories, consumption of local seasonal products, resistant to mining companies and macro projects, and peace with justice. In the quest to weave voices for the common house, the experiences that came together in this colloquium are the first fruits of the society we are building, realities that anticipate the future. A conclusion. The situation is desperate for the peoples of the world, for the workers, for the indigenous peoples, especially in this moment of a global crisis. There seems to be no clear path to move from an alternative popular position to a different one. The dominant ideology is against us, but that gives us a peculiar freedom and the opportunity to experiment. Getting rid of the deterministic model of objective needs and the obligatory stages of development, keeping a minimum of anti-determinism is sufficient. Not everything is predetermined in an objective situation. There is always room for a truly transformative action. Waiting patiently for a revolution's right movement is not enough. If we just wait, it will never come. It is necessary to begin with premature attempts. The alternative systems of economic production, the desire, like the one that now brings us together, to build a new world in which many worlds fit in, the unity of indigenous peoples and exploited groups can be fundamental to gradually build a counter-hegemonic globalization in the coming decades. The formula outlined here to move from the universal idea of equality to imprint a class bias on the economy to support the organization of poor or marginalized inhabitants, to facilitate politicization, to generate a new non-capitalist culture, to actively await the opportunity for a substantial change from the state's independent and autonomous position, and to be accompanied by struggles that seek to control the latter, can constitute the horizon of change for us to move. Let us, my call is to embrace a broad and far-reaching conception of economy in which we include objectives such as democratic participation, environmental sustainability, social, racial, ethical, and cultural equality, transnational solidarity, and also, why not, the directly anti-systemic action. Thank you very much.